Let food be thy medicine, and medicine be thy food. Hippocrates. This is mold. So is this, and this. It's disgusting and no one likes it, but mold isn't always a bad thing, and some kinds of mold have been used in medicine for a surprisingly long time. Hello and welcome to Old World Medicine. In today's video, bread and mold in ancient healing. Before we get started, I hope you'll take a moment to subscribe and hit the notification bell to keep up to date on future videos. Did you know penicillin was discovered almost completely by accident? Penicillin comes from Penicillium mold, but it turns out only a specific strain actually produces the right compound. In 1928, Dr. Alexander Fleming returned to his laboratory after a vacation and found one of his open-air bacterial cultures contaminated by a mold that appeared to have stopped the bacteria from growing. Now, Fleming didn't immediately know what species the mold was, or that it was responsible for killing his bacteria, but he was curious enough to do some experimenting to find out. He recorded his findings and the next year published what would become one of the most important articles in medical history, on the antibacterial action of cultures of a penicillium, with special reference to their use in the isolation of bee influenza. This article was printed in the British Journal of Experimental Medicine, Volume 10, Number 3. In a short 13 pages, and there's a link in the description below if you want to read the article, Fleming told the world, or at least the world of physicians at the time, that he had isolated a compound from a Penicillium rubens that was really good at killing different kinds of bacteria. Just to put this into perspective, since 1945 when penicillin became publicly available, some estimate over 200 million fewer people have died from bacterial infections. In addition, infant mortality plummeted from roughly 30% down to 3 to 5% in most parts of the world, and our life expectancies have doubled. Now, Fleming made the discovery, but two other doctors, Howard Walter Florey and Ernst Boris Chain, spent the better part of the next decade trying to stabilize the compound so that they could create a safe and reliable drug. It also took years to get production up and running, because they had to grow the mold in a controlled environment in order to harvest what they needed. But once they succeeded, all three doctors, Fleming, Florey, and Chain, were awarded with a 1945 Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine. As important as antibiotics are to us today, this video is about the history of mold and healing before antibiotics, because people have been using this stuff to treat diseases long before Alexander Fleming's little lab accident. Thousands of years ago, healers in Egypt, Greece, and Rome, and India, and no doubt plenty of other places as well, are known to have used fungus to treat infections. Ancient healers learned most of their treatments by observing life and death around them, by experimenting with plants and animal and mineral compounds, and by recording their own treatment recipes and collecting them from as many sources as they could. A lot of this had actually been passed down from generation to generation as a kind of medical folklore. How our ancestors figured out that fungus could sometimes prevent infections is a mystery, but we do have two Egyptian papyri from around 3,500 years ago that mention using moldy bread to cover and heal cuts. By the 2nd century CE, some 1600 years later, Galen of Pergamum, a Greek physician practicing in Rome, was also using moldy bread to treat cuts and surgical wounds. He did a great deal of his medical research on Roman gladiators, because they provided a steady source of trauma patients that he could observe. Many of the injured died, but he took great pains to record the process and to figure out who it was possible to treat and who was beyond saving. The next reference, and the last one I'll be talking about in this video, comes from the Lorcher Arzneibuch, Codex Bambergensis Medicinalis 1b, which was written around 788 to 795 CE and mentions using bread to treat wounds. So that creates our continuum, from Egypt around 1500 BCE to approximately 800 CE. Now, as I was saying, how it got started is a great question. It's unlikely someone just grabbed a chunk of moldy bread and jammed it into a cut to see what would happen. But studies in ancient history, especially when we don't have complete information, tend to focus on what reasonable explanations there could be for any particular event or development. So if we put our thinking cap on, we should be able to come up with a relatively logical explanation. Now, the first thing we need to remember is that our ancestors didn't know what germs were. The second is that concepts like what's clean and sanitary are very different in the ancient world. Lastly, there was a strong religious component in ancient medicine, partly because of physicians' ability to understand and treat illness was limited by the technology of the time, and partly because the influence of gods on everyday life was something they took into consideration a great deal. So, with those things in mind, let's say you're living in Egypt or Greece or Rome, anywhere between 2,000 and 4,000 years ago. You want to keep flies off your food, there's no refrigeration or plastic, and paper is crude and expensive. So the most common method was either storing your food in a clay jar, or, if you're on the move, wrapping it in cloth. If you use that cloth over and over again, the chances of mold spores getting onto it are pretty high, particularly if you didn't wash it very often. One thing we now know is that Penicillium molds tend to be most common in home environments, so it's not unlikely that this is where things were getting contaminated. So in our story here, our patient gets cut. Maybe while at work, maybe in a scuffle. Either way, he's bleeding and all he has to deal with it are the clothes he's wearing, his food cloth, and a piece of bread for lunch inside it. Now, bread is pretty absorbent, so it would help soak up blood and stop bleeding. We also know that poultices made from plants and a variety of animal and mineral compounds were common in antiquity as well, so packing a wound to help it heal wouldn't be unusual. Maybe our protagonist remembers something his grandmother said, so he grabs that bread and presses it over the wound, and then wraps it up in the cloth before saying a few prayers and carrying on. A few days later, he heads to the local healer and gets checked out. When the healer examines him, they don't find a fever. The patient looks relatively healthy. When they pull off the dressing, there's no nasty smell of pus or dead tissue, and the cut is well on its way to healing. And in their hands, there's just this stained cloth and a chunk of now moldy bread. Infections and injuries killed most people before they were 45 until around 1850. So this would likely be fairly unusual. And if it was, then the healer would want to know as much as possible about the patient and their unconventional wound dressing. Why? Because physicians in the ancient world were very aware that their medical treatments were only partly effective at best. Sometimes it came down to luck and how strong your body was as much as anything else they could do. So any knowledge that might help prevent someone from dying would be extremely valuable. And if bread wasn't a treatment option this particular healer knew of, maybe they write that down and incorporate it into their own practice. And over time, they see that yes, it does work. Sometimes. However, ancient healers got the idea that bread was sometimes useful in treating wounds, and that knowledge was passed along. From healers in Egypt, this knowledge was passed on to the Greeks and then the Romans, off to Persia, although it is safe to assume the Persians already knew since they had been in contact with Egypt long before Alexander the Great happened to wander through. And then finally, it makes its way back to Western Europe in the Middle Ages. And that's where we pick up the trail. Unfortunately, European medicine in the Middle Ages was a tragedy of errors. Part of the reason is that the Roman Empire fell into decline in the 4th and 5th centuries CE. When Roman armies either retreated or disbanded into local populations, the Roman provinces were left exposed to attack and conquest, usually by the people who already lived there and had been conquered by the Romans centuries before. At the same time, the Catholic Church, which was the largest and wealthiest organization in medieval Europe, was also doing its best to consolidate its influence over these newly created kingdoms. God first and King second, so to speak. There were Christian churches all over Europe, and because libraries and the collections of wealthy Romans were being taken over by locals who might not care what was written down in books they couldn't read, the clergy took great pains to preserve as many texts as they could. They had the manpower and authority to actively collect whatever they found, places to put it, like churches or monasteries, and people who could read and write Latin and Greek to make copies. But this also means that the church had a lot of influence over who got access to that knowledge, as well as what knowledge was considered appropriate. Always wary of ideas that might challenge their teachings, endanger social order and the importance of God and the church in everyday life, and likewise their political power and the ties they collected, the Catholic Church would actively screen books and new ideas for heresy, and might imprison and or kill anyone who challenged what they interpret to be the will of God. Both of these forces, obedience to the church and a new social order based on local aristocrats, helped to stratify societies in Europe into what we have come to call the feudal system. What this means for medicine is that there was a long period where several important blockades to medical advancement were in place. First, clergy tended to regard illness as both a corporeal and supernatural issue, where God had sent illness as a punishment or a test, and that getting better was ultimately in his hands. This may help to explain why they believed that trepanation, drilling a hole into your skull to let out evil spirits, was a treatment for any number of mental illnesses at the time. However, there was also a reliance on rote medical knowledge, where earlier approved texts could not be questioned, even texts that contained inaccuracies due to faulty observations or typographical errors that crept in as they were being copied, painstakingly by hand, usually by monks, over and over again. And if a monk happened to misread or disagree with the original work, he might alter the text in order to ensure it made sense, or didn't conflict with the accepted interpretation of Scripture. It's important to remember that these works were written in either Latin or Greek, and the general population wouldn't have learned to read or write, so the only people capable of deciphering these books would have been kings and nobles, the clergy, wealthy merchants, scribes, and/or some of their family members. So between the fall of the Roman Empire in Western Europe and the Renaissance, the restrictive policies of the church and monarchs meant that physicians in Western Europe during the Middle Ages had access to fragmentary and often misinterpreted information. Just to give you some examples, if a doctor believed you had too much fluid in your body, they might induce vomiting, diarrhea, or conduct bloodletting, thereby weakening you against any illness you were suffering from. Likewise, if you were wounded, many physicians at the time believed that pus was a good sign, and so would do things to encourage its production. That meant they would intentionally compromise a wound, in other words make it dirtier, so that pus would develop. Nevertheless, there are always a few doctors who are looking for new treatments and novel ways to improve survivability, no matter what the rules are. That's why we eventually pick up a reference to bread and mold as a treatment in the Lorcher Arzneii book, which I said a little earlier was written around 788 to 795 CE. We don't know how prevalent this treatment was at any point in time, whether it was common enough to be used all over the place, or something that just popped up every now and again when someone dusted off a copy of the Galenic Corpus. The fact that multiple records have survived from antiquity to the present day, however, means that someone, somewhere, was preserving them and reading them. Which means it also stands to reason that whoever was doing that likely knew about moldy bread and, at times, used it on wounds when they thought it would help. So there you have it, bread and mold in ancient healing. One last thing. Did moldy bread as a medical treatment even work? One thing we should always remember when it comes to old world medicine is that just because treatments seem to work doesn't mean they actually did anything. There's plenty of anecdotal evidence that certain plants or animal or mineral compounds work on the human body. And we have been able to prove scientifically that they worked because of an actual pharmacological action. But another thing that also has a surprisingly significant effect on healing is placebo. Hope, in other words. That's partly why so many treatments involved rituals and offerings to the gods. Medical practitioners in the ancient world couldn't conduct carefully controlled studies, so we have to take everything they observed with a grain of salt, because when it comes to science, seeing and believing is very different from knowing. Just to illustrate, some Penicillin molds are known to produce toxins that are very dangerous to animals and people if they're ingested. That's part of the reason it took so long for Drs. Chain and Fleury to create penicillin after Fleming's discovery. They had to figure out a way to get rid of the bad stuff. Well, there you have it. I'll be back with more old world medicine soon, so until then, stay healthy and wash your hands.